So how in the world do you take a tiny island, one with literally zero natural resources, that's just been kicked out of its own country, and turn it into one of the richest nations on Earth, and do it in just 50 years? Well, that's the story of Singapore. It's the story of the impossible nation that somehow became a reality.
I mean, just look at this contrast. When Singapore was born, back in 1965, it had, well, nothing. No resources, no army, not even enough water to drink. It had just been unceremoniously kicked out of Malaysia and basically left for dead. Flash forward to today, it's a massive global financial hub. The average person there is actually wealthier than the average American. So the big question is, how on earth did they pull that off? All right, to really get how they made this incredible comeback, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to understand why this little island was so important in the first place. See, long before it was a country, it was a prize worth fighting for. So the modern story really kicks off way back in 1819. A guy from Britain, Stamford Raffles, sets up a trading port here, and it was the perfect spot, right on the world's busiest shipping lanes. But all that colonial confidence, it just came crashing down in 1942. The so-called impenetrable fortress fell to a Japanese invasion. After the war, there was this brief, really troubled merger with Malaysia in 1963, and that lasted all of 2 years before, boom, Singapore was kicked out on its own.
And that fall to the Japanese, wow, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a huge psychological blow. I mean, Winston Churchill himself called it the worst disaster in British military history. Think about that. That moment completely shattered this myth of European invincibility in the region, and it's what really planted the seeds for a future of independence, even if nobody knew what that future would look like.
And that brings us right to the moment of crisis. The whole idea of merging with Malaysia was supposed to be Singapore's lifeline, its key to survival. Instead, it had failed. And not just failed, it failed spectacularly. I mean, just try to put yourself in their shoes for a second. The situation looked completely hopeless. Let's list it out. You have no natural resources, not even enough fresh water. You've got massive unemployment and really tense racial divisions. You have no army to protect yourself. And to top it all off, you're surrounded by much larger neighbors who are, let's just say, suspicious of you. The odds of survival, frankly, they were about zero.
And this feeling of total doom, it went all the way to the top. The country's brand new leader, a man named Kuan, he had to go on television to announce the separation, and he just broke down, crying, right there on camera. And let's be clear, those weren't tears of joy. He was crying because he truly, genuinely believed that his new nation was completely doomed.
But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. Instead of just giving in to despair, Kuan and his team got to work. They came up with this radical survival blueprint. And the plan was kind of crazy. They decided they weren't going to solve one crisis at a time. No, they were going to solve all of them at the same time.
Okay, so problem number one was about as basic as it gets. Water. Think about it. How do you keep your country alive when your main water supply is controlled by the very nation that just kicked you to the curb? Their solution was just brilliant. And it was total. First thing they did, they decided to maximize every single inch of land. They built reservoirs and huge water catchment areas all over the island. Then, they turned pretty much every building's roof into a water collector. And on top of all that, they started pioneering technology to turn seawater into drinking water. You know, desalination. The key takeaway here is they became absolutely obsessed with being self-sufficient. All right, so with the water problem being tackled, the next huge emergency was already staring them in the face: jobs. I mean, what do you sell when you have nothing to sell? How do you build a whole economy literally from scratch? And this is where their thinking was just so radical, so different. You have to remember, back in the 60s, most developing countries were all about being self-sufficient, closing their borders to foreign influence. Singapore did the exact opposite. They threw their doors wide open. They made a promise to the world: come here and you'll get zero corruption, low taxes, and the solid rule of law. Their goal? To become the most business-friendly place on the entire planet. A safe, stable bridge between the East and the West. So, the plan worked. Foreign investment started to pour in, but that created a new problem, one that was literally boiling over on the streets. You see, most of the population was still living in these incredibly overcrowded, unsanitary slums. The government's plan to fix this was, honestly, a masterstroke. Here's how it worked. Step 1. Create a special housing development board to just build tons of high-quality apartments at a massive scale.
Step 2, they made everyone save money through a mandatory national savings plan. Now, step 3, and this is the really clever part, they allowed people to use that forced savings to buy their own government-built homes. And this wasn't just about housing, it was social engineering. They deliberately mixed different ethnic groups together in these new buildings to help create a single, unified Singaporean identity.
And the results? I mean, they were staggering. By the 1980s, more than 80% of all Singaporeans were living in public housing that they themselves owned. Think about that. This didn't just solve a housing crisis. It gave every single citizen a real, tangible stake in the success of their country.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got water, we've got an economy starting to hum, and people have homes. But Lee Kuan Yew understood something fundamental. When you have no natural resources, your people are your only resource. So, the next big challenge was obvious. How do you develop that resource?
The answer was a super pragmatic, future-focused education system. The blueprint was simple: build schools everywhere, teach everyone. And here was the key move: make English the official language for international business, but make sure every student was also bilingual, fluent in their own mother tongue too. What they were doing was literally engineering a globally competitive workforce from the ground up.
And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle: defense. How does a tiny little nation survive surrounded by giants? Well, Lee Kuan Yew had a very simple and honestly kind of chilling philosophy. He said, we make ourselves poisonous to swallow.
So how do you become a poison pill? The solution was a citizens' army. They introduced mandatory military service for every single able-bodied male citizen. Now, the goal here wasn't really to win a war outright. It was to make the cost of invading them so incredibly painfully high that no one would ever even dare to try it.
Okay, so all of this progress is absolutely incredible, right? But it all came at a price. See, to pull off this amazing transformation, Singapore's leaders made a very clear choice. They chose order over chaos. And that decision had some pretty big implications for personal freedom.
And when we say strict, we mean strict. Chewing gum? Banned. Vandalism? That could get you punished by caning. On a bigger scale, the government kept tight control over the media, and political opposition was, well, severely limited. This was the fundamental bargain at the heart of the Singapore model. You sacrifice some of your individual freedoms in exchange for collective security and prosperity.
And Lee Kuan Yew himself, he was completely unapologetic about this trade-off. The way he saw it, the choice was simple and direct. As he put it, you can have free speech in a failing country, or you can have prosperity and order. He made a bet, a huge gamble, that for a nation staring into the abyss, most people would choose prosperity every time.
So, whether you agree with all the methods or not, one thing is for sure: the results are just impossible to deny. This 50-year experiment didn't just work, it spectacularly transformed Singapore from what was considered a third-world nation into a first-world economic powerhouse.
Today, the slums are long gone, replaced by one of the most famous, gleaming skylines in the world. But this brings us to the final and maybe the most crucial question of all: the Singapore model. A system built by a small group of incredibly determined founders to solve a very specific set of crises. It clearly worked, but the question for today is, was it built to last?